name's Carl Couch. I was born in New York City. Didn't hear my New York accent, did you? And grew up in 4 places because my father was a minister. He was a minister in New York City, Ohio, Tennessee, and then by the time I was in the 6th or 7th grade, we moved to Florida, which I sort of consider my home because my father served in a church there for basically almost 30 years. My father's name was Eddie Couch. Dad was a Little Rock, Arkansas native, born in a small town north of Little Rock. Grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. Born into a railroad family. His father and his 2 older brothers were railroad engineers. Each one of them was the senior engineer on the Missouri Pacific Railroad line, which was based out of Little Rock. And my dad was probably a much more studious and academic and definitely more spiritual person than his brothers. And he decided to go into the ministry after college, or during college, and prepared himself for ministry and served as a minister for almost 65 years in the Church of Christ. Dad was a pastor. I think most pastors either excel at preaching and teaching, administration, or pastoral work. And although my father was a good preacher, he was a pastor. And so he was in the lives of people. When he died, I have a small book where he recorded the names of most or all of the people that he knew that he had led to Christ. And it's a long book. Dad influenced my life, I think, first of all, that I know he loved Jesus and I've loved Jesus. I probably went through as many of the rebellious phases of being a preacher's kid as most people do. But as I matured, learned to appreciate so much what he did, and that he was who he was because God made him effective in that way. And Dad served as a minister until a month before his death, just influencing people and being in their lives. It's interesting, you know, when your parents really age, sometimes you sort of take on a role of caretaker. And yet my dad was also caretaking because my mother was very ill for many years before her death. And Dad died before Mother. My mother was a homemaker, but also worked some of her life in business as a secretary or an assistant, and later on was actually a realtor in her later years. I have one sister who's 4 years younger. Although I was probably very intolerant of a younger sister when I was younger, recently I've realized I really love my sister. I married at the end of college to a wonderful woman that has now been my wife for 47 years this summer. The joy of my life. She's an Oklahoma native, grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. We met in college in Abilene, Texas. We then decided to marry, and she went with me to medical school, worked as a teacher while I went through medical school. Our first child was born during my 3rd year of medical school, and our second child was born during my internship after medical school when we came back to Texas. I went to medical school at the University of Florida, my home state, then came back to Parkland to complete my training after medical school, and I've been in Dallas ever since. Only after my dad became sick and we realized how much he was caring for my mother. He was getting up all night long, every night, changing her and taking care of her, and then getting up in the morning and going to the church where he worked and doing his pastoral duties. And did that until he just suddenly became sick. And I remember 2 or 3 days before his death, as he asked me a question, he said, "I've tried to do the best I can for your mother, did I do okay? And of course my answer to him was, you did great. I think everybody wants to be purposeful and to know that your life, really was spent the way it should be spent. And clearly, Dad he never wrote a book, and but he had a wonderful life, faithful to the end. Yeah. Never made a large income, but yet we found near his death there was enough money to take care of my mother for 7 years in a nursing home. And we did. And great guy. My mother's name was Grace Shirey Couch, and her family grew up in rural Pennsylvania. Her father was illiterate. He was one of the youngest, I think, of 8 brothers, no sisters. And his parents thought that when you reached the 3rd grade, you ought to work on the farm. And so he went to work on the farm, dairy farm, with his 7 brothers. And later on, learned a few trade skills and became kind of a refrigeration expert, and married my grandmother. And that's the home my mother grew up in, a small town in Pennsylvania. She was, mother was intelligent, but only had a little tiny bit of college, maybe a year. But was a smart gal, good with numbers, good with many things, and very resourceful. When I grew up, my family was poor, and I didn't know it because Mother was so resourceful that my father was preaching for a church in Manhattan during World War II when I was born. And although Dad made less than $100 a month during a time when the average income was far more than that, particularly in New York City, we always had enough to eat, and if she had to make the clothes, she made the clothes, and we did fine. I never knew I was poor.